So just give me a 30-second introduction of who you are and why you're interested in the nicotine world.
So I'm Chris Allen, Chief Executive Officer of Broughton. So Broughton is a contract research organisation. Essentially our focus is analytical chemistry and toxicology, which is really looking at what's in a product, how does a product behave, and what's the potential effect of that product on the human health.
So you're at the front line of determining how safe or otherwise these things actually are.
Relatively safe, yes. So obviously the term safety is used sort of very carefully, but really you're trying to understand that potential sort of positive and negative effect of the product, how it could affect health.
So explain to me, as if I'm like a 5-year-old child or a Labrador, right? You've got a product that comes in and you want to determine how relatively safe it is. What sort of a process does that product go through?
A lot of our focus is, you may have heard of HPHC testing, so that's harmful and potentially harmful constituents. So there's certain analytes that are mandated by FDA to look at, but it very much depends on the product, what you're actually looking for. So if we're looking at a nicotine product, you're looking for impurities such as tobacco-specific nitrous amines, which are highly carcinogenic. They can come from the manufacturing process or the quality of the raw materials, but they can also form over time. So one of the big things we do is we actually put products under very, very controlled conditions. We'll analyse those products maybe every 3 months, and you're looking for changes in the chemical structure of those products.
So that would be what I would call stability testing. What about aerosol testing? I want to talk a little bit about this because one of the really interesting things about the history of the tobacco industry is that the whole light scandal was predicated on analytical methods that were used to test cigarette smoke and how many bad things there were in cigarette smoke. How similar are the methods, and why are those methods reliable when so many people said they weren't over so many years?
I think they're just ingrained sort of in that sort of industrial sort of industry. Over time those methods developed. Caressa do a fantastic job. I think the one thing you have to be careful is that as products change, methodology is not always as suitable as it used to be. So if you have a naturally occurring tobacco product, there's a lot of variation in the product, so you can live with variation in your method. We're seeing now products are essentially moving more closer to NRTs, so traditional medicinal nicotine products. So FDA are expecting to see higher levels of precision. They're looking for lower levels of constituents to assess that health effect. So I think the methods are evolving rapidly.
But in very, very simple terms, what do? You get a vape, you hook it up to a machine, and then what happens?
You collect the aerosol. That would either be in a liquid or on a filter pad, so fairly basic. I think after that, probably the best way of describing it is, have you ever put a Smartie on a filter paper at primary school?
I did.
Seeing the colours separate. So that essentially is chromatography. So a lot of the work we do are chromatographic techniques, which is very similar. So you actually put the sample onto the instrument and it separates out the constituents, but instead of your eye detecting those different colours, we're using mass spectrometry to smash the molecules up so we can actually sort of understand what they are. So we look at the ions that are coming out of those, and that can determine what those constituents are, and then also the levels of those constituents.
Okay, so when we compare the constituents that you'll get off your filter pad when you're testing, say, just call a vape for now, compare that to what you get in a cigarette, can you just run me through a sort of idea of how those two things compare?
They do not compare in the slightest. Typically, obviously, tobacco, you're combusting, so you're getting all of the combustion analytes, so benzopyrenes, the number is huge. I mean, we're talking over sort of 4,000 or 5,000 constituents and they're continuously identifying more constituents. For a vape product, it's more the majority of the constituents are transferred from the liquid. So you're looking at basically aerosolizing that liquid and you're capturing those. But you do have a lot of flavour constituents, but the other things you have to be really careful of, thermal degradants, so those flavours can actually degrade, and also things that can leach out of the plastic. So if you're testing a tobacco product now, you've got a very clear list of defined analytes, generally byproducts of combustion you should be looking for. If you're testing a vape product, there are certain markers that you would use, so carbonyls, for example, because they're thermal degradation products, but aside from that, every single product will have a very, very different profile. So trying to compare sort of product versus product, you could use a group of markers, but the actual constituents within that product would be hugely different to another.
So essentially what goes in comes back out?
Ideally, and that's, I think, what a lot of companies are trying to create. They're trying to create products that will transfer that liquid to an aerosol with minimal change. But in a lot of products, you do see changes in those constituents.
And how much variation do you see between different products, and what drives it?
Probably the main thing is the ingredients, and especially where people start using natural ingredients, that becomes very complex, because you could start with one natural mixture, which is actually made up of 5 different natural ingredients, and a natural ingredient could be made up of 50 to 100 different chemicals. So you can have very sort of clean synthetic products. So people think natural must be better, but actually in this phase, generally sort of natural can present certain health risks.
Tell me a little bit about Chris Allen. How did you, non-smoker from a village in North Yorkshire, turn into the man who analyzes vapes?
My family do nickname me Darth Vapor at times.
And now so will the rest of us.
Yes, but I mean, our sort of journey started really sort of in the pharmaceutical industry within Broughton, so coming up to 20 years in business now. And we're working on nicotine replacement therapies. So we were testing gums, lozenges. We had an opportunity to work on a medicinal licensed product. So the product at the time was Evoke, so we got involved in a lot of the chemistry, the stability testing. And we found it was a very unique product to work with, and we became interested in that. We'd learned a lot of the techniques, understood about the technology, and that took us into the Tobacco Products Directive. So we started working on those testing programs, and then eventually into the pre-market tobacco applications for the US. And I think it's one of those areas where you do feel you want to make a difference as a business. So in the pharmaceutical industry, obviously we're testing medicines that are saving lives. I think working in this industry, it allowed us to move that more from cure into prevention. And when you actually see the damning statistics behind the harm, the death and disease that combustibles cause, to actually have a role in trying to counteract that was something that really sort of got inside of me, inside of the business, and that's a passion that really does drive us.
So a lot of people are down on British business at the moment. You've built a very successful one, and that one that has grown, certainly in the 15 years or so that I've interacted with it, has grown remarkably quickly and it continues to grow in a part of the country that's not normally associated with dynamism and entrepreneurship, although it is very beautiful. Mm-hmm. How have you found, for example, attracting the staff that you need? Is it difficult to convince, very, very highly qualified chemists to move up into the Yorkshire Dales?
It's not that difficult now. Unfortunately, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. A lot of the industry is really struggling. There are lots of people looking for jobs. So actually recruiting people now is not a challenge. What we tend to do, and what we really like to do as a business as well, is build people through the business. So we've got a fantastic track record. So 3 of our strategic management team members all joined as fresh graduates about 15 years ago. So it's a long, slow process, but we like to sort of bring in that talent at a young age, bring them through the business, but complement it with expertise coming in externally. So to date, recruitment has not been a major issue.
But the business environment in the UK in general, I mean, people are very down on the UK economy. What's the UK doing wrong, just outside of the nicotine world? As somebody who manages and runs a successful STEM business, why aren't more people doing it?
Whether it's a popular opinion or not, I think Brexit has caused lots of problems. I certainly respect sort of the UK government's decision to allow medicines, for example, to come in from Europe without needing additional testing. The Europeans have not treated the UK with any degree of favourability. They view the UK as a third country. So therefore, any activities performed in the UK, there would need to be quality control testing in the EU. So they treat the UK the same way they would treat India or China. That has really damaged manufacturing in the UK. I think there's a big push sort of on innovation, certainly within the scientific industry, but they seem to be forgetting about manufacturing and those sorts of jobs. I think what they also don't realise, well, certainly don't seem to be creating any action from it. And this was a chap I met the other day who's an operations director at a major medical device company, and he was referencing that point. For every job in manufacturing, it probably affects about another 10 jobs in terms of taxi drivers, the local economy, and there seems to be a push away from real solid core skills to everything must be innovative. So that's where all the money is going, rather than supporting, you know, a lot of existing businesses.
Interesting. The north of England, particularly Manchester, has always had quite a strong vape manufacturing business. To an extent, you've been kind of lucky to be there. What's driven that? Why this business in this bit of the country at this moment?
I have no idea. Yes, you've got essentially the vape triangle around sort of Blackburn, that area, and I'm not sure. It could just be coincidence that there was a few entrepreneurs in that area. There is lots of manufacturing capability. You know, there is a lot of office space, there's a lot of warehouse space, manufacturing space, probably related to cost of living as well. There is a lower cost of living in that area, which allows to keep wages down and for companies to be more competitive.
Back to the nicotine question. There's these huge differences between the way that the UK approaches it, the way that different European countries approach it, the way that the Americans approach it, and even between Australia and New Zealand. What do you think is driving it? Can you tell what's driving it? We're asking everybody this. And
my personal belief is generally it's politics. It's politics, and also it's lack of information. You can't expect our MPs to know everything about everything. That's just not the case. And therefore, I don't think it takes a lot to actually change their opinion. I was talking to Tadas from Green Butts yesterday, and he said the misinformation that was being discussed in the tobacco and vapes bill debate around sustainability, you know, and an MP stood up and the Lord claimed that there was still plastics within completely biodegradable filters, which is not true. It only takes one person with authority to say that, everybody listens. That can drive a legislation. It's crazy. So I think a lot of it is driven by politics and misinformation.
So, in the UK specifically, have you seen the data that you produce, which huge volumes of data? Maybe give us an idea of how much data you're producing on the various products that come your way. Is the aggregate of that data useful for policy making? Is there a way of communicating what that data says in a really elegant way?
It's quite difficult to put it into I would say a simple perspective for somebody to understand that. I think we've really got to tackle the most basic elements first. So we recently did some work for trading standards where I think there was about 60, 70 products purchased from the marketplace that we assessed. I think only 3 of the products met the GSPR requirements. You know, even just down to things like labelling, the labels weren't in English. Some of the products were actually snus, you know, so they were actually tobacco snus. There was products with mould. You know, these are basic things. If companies can't even meet those basic requirements, I think going into a deeper narrative is potentially wasting time at the moment.
You're referring to pouches and snus there. I didn't realise you were working with those. How recent is that for you? What have you had to learn to be able to test those?
That was, I would say, was an easier transition because a lot of the labs that we compete against, they've derived from the tobacco industry. We've come from the pharmaceutical industry. We still have that as a really strong part of the business. It's our heritage. And a lot of that work, nicotine gums, nicotine lozenges, there's not too much difference between a pouch. Whereas, say, a lot of the traditional labs, sort of, the vape space is closer to traditional combustible tobacco products, but they're starting to move more towards that pharmaceutical standard. Pouches was a very, very easy transition because essentially it is a pharmaceutical style solid dose product inserted in the mouth, generally quite clean in terms of the matrix. So it just fitted into our core competency very, very easily.
What can you tell us about what you're finding in nicotine pouches at the moment?
It's becoming a very congested market. On a sort of non-chemistry perspective, the biggest concern is what companies are trying to do to stand out. We saw this with the vape products. You see the high-strength products, you see the flavours, you see the packaging, because companies are basically replicating a product that exists and they're trying to market it in a different manner. So that's probably my biggest concern from a safety perspective. I think people are making dangerous assumptions about the safety of ingredients because they'll say, these are food-grade ingredients. Well, that's fine, but food-grade ingredients still have inclusion levels which they shouldn't exceed. And companies are doing that. And this is not sort of a one-time, you put it in your mouth and eat that sort of once, twice a day. people are having these products in continuously through the day. So I think people are not aware still of the potential health risk. Obviously, it's negligible in comparison to smoking combustibles, but I think people need educating a bit more about product design and really starting to create product standards.
So on a macro level, it's obviously nothing compared to combustibles, but there is a residual risk that can be reduced further through the correct kind of practices. To what extent is that risk material when you compare it to cigarettes?
It's very low compared to cigarettes, but that doesn't mean it can't be better. You know, I think we should always strive. It's not to make, you have to be careful not to make the product so benign that it doesn't appeal to consumers. But I think a lot of products could improve in terms of their safety profile.
Okay. Chris, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you.